Greetings. My name is Dave Goldenberg, and I am now Dean Emeritus of the University of Hartford. I was the Senior Dean of the university and professor. And it's my pleasure to be with you here today with One Day University for my third edition of Trials That Shaped America. It's part of a class that I teach for the undergraduate students at the University of Hartford. And I hope you'll enjoy what is certainly one of my favorite and most interesting of cases, which is Cassius Clay versus the United States. You know, this is the iconic photograph that people have in their minds and actually in their offices. I have a friend who has this picture hanging on the wall in her office. And it is a depiction of the greatest, of Muhammad Ali, and how we view him at this moment. And, it's not my favorite photograph of him. My favorite is actually from the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. And it's there, you might recall, that he came on with the torch. He was going to be the final torch bearer after it had gone throughout the world, and he was the one that was going to light up the flame of the Olympics. And at that moment, the cheering of a worldwide audience and of other people from all the different countries around the world cheered for this man. And he was, in their hearts and their minds, the greatest. And it is something that is a reclamation of his self, because back in 1966, there was the New York Times described him as despicable and reprehensible, and that he was a taker and not a giver, as he refused to go into the army back in the Vietnam War. And that's what I want to talk with you about today, is this case of Cassius Clay versus the United States. It's interesting that Ken Burns did a magnificent documentary about Muhammad Ali. And he too recalls this moment at the Olympics, because after being vilified in the 60s, here he is in 1996, 20 years later, as not just the greatest athlete in the world, he is suddenly the most loved individual in the world. And that's the way Ken Burns put it, and I would agree with him. It was interesting, I saw an interview with Ali later in his life. And somebody asked him, how do you wish to be remembered? What will people say about you when they say, after you're gone, how should they remember you? How should they think of you? And this is what he said. He said, I have a recipe for life. He said, he took a few cups of love. He took 1 tablespoon of patience, 1 teaspoon of generosity, 1 pint of kindness. He took 1 quart of laughter and 1 pinch of concern. And then he mixed willingness with happiness. He added lots of faith, and he stirred it up well. And then he spread it over the span of a lifetime, and he served it to every deserving person he met. This was the Muhammad Ali at the end of his life. And yes, he was the greatest. But let's go back. Back in 1950, people don't realize this, but in 1959, he was the national amateur champ, both 1959 and 60. And as a result, he was the one that was going to represent the United States at the 1960 Olympics that were to be held in Rome, and he was classified as what we could call a light heavyweight. And he won the gold medal. And what is wonderful, what's fascinating in terms of this, is he was all of 18 years old. And here, so remember then, this is 1960, he was the national amateur champ as a 17-year-old, and then as an 18-year-old going off to the Olympics where he wins the gold medal. And it's in that year that follows that he identifies himself with being a member of the Nation of Islam. Thought was interesting. I managed to capture a photo from the Olympic ceremony of 1960. There he is on the gold medal stand. You know, it's an interesting thing in terms of segregation in the South in the 60s. He returned home to Louisville, Kentucky, and he went to have dinner in a restaurant downtown, and he was denied service because he was Black. And the sign I have up there for you is an example exactly of the kinds of signage that was in windows in Louisville at the time that would cater simply to whites only. But this was segregation in the 60s, and it plays an important part in terms of him determining the person he is to become. The myth is, and I say myth because he was so angry at being denied dinner. Here he is, the gold medal winner of the Olympics, and he can't get dinner in his own hometown. And he says that he threw his gold medal into the Ohio River. The Ohio River separates southern Indiana from Louisville, Kentucky. Now, in interviews with his friends and the biographies that come out afterwards, his friends say, you know, he didn't really throw it into the Ohio River. Instead, he misplaced it somewhere. He was 18 years old. 18-year-olds do silly, stupid things at times. And he didn't keep track of his medal, and it was either stolen or it was lost or whatever. But no, he did not throw it actually into the Ohio River. If you're interested, Richard Dunham's book of the biography of Muhammad Ali is certainly well worth your time if this kind of background is something that you're interested in learning more about. So he goes ahead. Now, if we move ahead 4 years, he beats Sonny Liston at age 22, and he becomes the heavyweight champion of the world. And, you know, just as a matter of record, you know, he won 92% of his fights, 37 of the 56 he won by knockout. I mean, he had a stellar career, 92% wins over the course of a career. It's really rather remarkable. But in March 1964, 2 weeks after becoming the heavyweight champion, he now, having embraced the Nation of Islam after winning the gold medal, he now publicly announces that he is changing his name. He is no longer going to go by the name Cassius Clay. He'll make commentary that that is his slave name. He was given to his family, and that he was going to take on a new name in the Nation of Islam. And the name came as Muhammad Ali. It was given to him by the head of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. And Muhammad in Nation of Islam means one worthy of praise. And of course, he is worthy of praise as being the heavyweight champion of the world. He's one of the greatest and most recognizable athletes in the world. But Elijah Muhammad said, yes, also worthy of praise as someone who is going to take on the quest for civil rights, that this will be his ultimate triumph. Well, in February 1966, Ali is classified as 1A. Now, if you don't know the selective service system, there was 1A, which meant that you could be drafted into the Army. And in 1966, we were fighting a conflict in Vietnam. We weren't really calling it the Vietnam War. It was considered much like Korea, police action at that time. But at one point, finally, it's called, this is the Vietnam War. But people were also classified as other things. So for example, I was classified as 2S, which meant I was a student in college studying. And as long as I was in good academic standing, I could maintain my 2S prior to being classified as 1A. Or you could have been a 4F, which meant there was something that was an inhibitor to you being able to serve. And so he's classified as 1A. And he declares to the press, I am a conscientious objector. And he says, war is against the teachings of the Holy Quran. And so, as I said, he embraces civil rights. You know, there's a wonderful movie called One Night in Miami. But the interesting thing about the movie is that the writer said, you know, this is fictionalized. The four key characters in the movie, Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali, indeed, they did meet in Miami on that evening after winning the heavyweight championship of the world. And each of them did speak about the need to take their place in the civil rights movement, and that Sam Cooke would write songs, and that Jim Brown would leave the Cleveland Browns, and that Muhammad Ali would rise up and take his place as a spokesperson. You see here a picture of him with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he is embracing in a much stronger degree than before the importance of civil rights. And so he says to the press, why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? He comes back to the denial of services for the restaurants in Louisville. He says, so I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. At this moment, he is becoming a spokesperson on every newspaper in America about what he views the role of the United States in the Vietnam War and his role he'll take or not take in it. So let's take a look at this thing called the conscientious objector, because you may not be aware of it. But there are three things that a person must satisfy, all three, in order to be considered a conscientious objector. First is, individual has to be opposed to war in any form. And this was established in a legal case before the Supreme Court called Gillette. Second is, the individual's objection must be based on a religious training or belief. This too is based on a Supreme Court case called Seeger. And the third is, the individual's objection must be sincere. And this comes to us from Whitmer versus the United States. And so here we have these three things an individual must satisfy in order to move into this. I always like to, in the three talks I've given for One Day University, I like to bring a historical perspective into it. So I'd like to take us back in time a little bit and start with the year 295 AD. Maximilianus was drafted into the Roman legions. He is actually the first recorded conscientious objector. And he shares that he cannot fight for his religious beliefs. And he is afforded that opportunity to not have to fight in the legions. what happens over time is that there is kind of this bifurcation of how one views conscientious objection. And that is, sometimes there is war as the aggressor, as the Romans were, and why he would not serve. And yet there's also this question that we'll see rise up, which is, what if it is defense of your own property? What then do you do? Well, it moves here to the United States. If we move forward in time, the Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to serve in any army. And it's on their grounds, they believe Christians should be neutral in all worldly conflicts. They take as their rationale the Bible, and they go to the New Testament. Romans 12:19 says, "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord." And because of this position, the Jehovah's Witnesses have actually been jailed over time for this particular position. We know Buddhism to believe in nonviolence. It is one of the 5 precepts that is found in Buddhism. It is one of the precepts. I undertake the precept to refrain from destroying living creatures. Dalai Lama, who you see here, who's the head of the Buddhist religion, says war should be relegated to the dustbin of history. In feudal times, if one did not wish to fight, one could avoid service if you could get somebody to take your place. And again, interestingly, it comes straight, this time from the Old Testament, from Deuteronomy 20:18. It says, "Then the officer shall add, is any man afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home so that his brothers will not become disheartened too." Leaders understood that one's reluctance raises the question of, do you have my back? Will you raise up to defend me if I find myself in trouble? Will you be there by my side? And the officers say, go home then. If you can't do this, leave. Jump to the American Revolution, and it varied state by state. Pennsylvania, I give as an example, they actually leveled a tax. And what I found so interesting is the tax is based on how long does it take to train a soldier. So if you're not going to be prepared, at least pay for the money that we need in order to train someone who's going to take your place. Interestingly, a large percentage in old Pennsylvania were Quakers. Quakers are anti-violence, anti-war, and they actually refused to go to war, and they refused to pay the tax. And so colonial America confiscated much of their properties. We jump to the Civil War, the Union. That was the first official draft. 1862, Abraham Lincoln puts in place the first official draft, but puts into it, you could pay $300 and not have to serve. And where would that money go? It went to the families of the wounded. So help you with the medical costs to care for the loved one who's been sent home. The Confederacy, on the other hand, they, in the books, it sometimes says, you're not going to fight for the Confederacy, move to the north. You're obviously a northern sympathizer. Go to the north, or go hide in the mountains. Or you could pay $500 to the Confederate Treasury, which, of course, all through the war needed money. In World War I, things change. It becomes a little more vindictive. Conscientious objectors are sentenced to 15 years in jail and hard labor. However, in 1918, they've gone ahead and sent all the young men over to France. And as a result, farms are left without family members to till the land. Prisoners are paroled in order to do things, become firefighters, as they say. All the things that one might say is public service, alternative service. Suddenly there's this rise. You've been sentenced to 15 years, but you can go ahead and have this alternative service. Now, World War II, and I absolutely love this. You got to believe in the bureaucracy of the American government. Don't you know that by World War II, the government has come up with a form? Of course, they've come up with a form. And naturally, it's got 10 questions. You'd think this was something on Facebook. If you answer these 10 questions and tell us a little bit about yourself, we'll tell you whether or not you are a true conscientious objector. And some of the questions on the original were things like, describe the nature of your belief, which is the basis of your claim. Describe the actions and behaviors in your life, which, in your opinion, most conspicuously demonstrate the consistency and depth of your religious convictions. Remember, religion having to be one of the three reasons that one can be a conscientious objector. And if one was given this, they took a page out of World War I and set up formally, alternative service for those who'd been approved. And so that brings us up to post-World War II. Suddenly, now that we've got a department, a form that's been created by the government, the Department of the Justice Department identifies what I gave you at the onset, which are what are the three conditions, all three that must be met in order to be considered a true conscientious objector. I really love the fact that the government doesn't simply say conscientious objector. They say, what is a true conscientious objector? They're trying to edit out, if you will, people who are simply trying to avoid military service. So you have to have these three things opposed to all war. You have to be relating this to a religious objection. You must show that you are sincere. So let's come back to 1966 and Muhammad Ali. And he has been using the name Muhammad Ali. And we find ourselves in this question that is before you today is, does it ring true to you that he was a conscientious objector and opposed to the war in Vietnam? So he lives in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ali files an appeal with his local draft board. Now, local draft boards, the Selective Service Board, is made up of citizens. Oftentimes, it would be individuals who had served in World War II and are now living locally, vets, served in the Korean conflict, they're living locally. It's not something that's made up of governmental officials. And, but, this notion of the Selective Service Board, they're receiving this appeal from Muhammad Ali, and it is their responsibility to review his case and either support it or not. And they are inclined to support his appeal. However, because he is a national, worldwide symbol, if you will, in terms of the boxing world, the local draft board decides that they want an advisory recommendation from the United States Department of Justice. So they request that. And Justice Department goes ahead and says, they reach out from Washington to a judge in Kentucky, Lawrence Grauman. And he is going to go ahead and write up a report back to the Department of Justice. He's not writing to the Selective Service Board. He's writing directly to Washington, D.C. And, he interviews everybody. I mean, the neighbors, the friends, people he works out with in the gym. He interviewed Ali himself. And in the end, Judge Grauman goes ahead and says, I believe that Ali is sincere in his beliefs. So now, you've got the Selective Service Board. Their first inclination is that Ali is sincere. And Now you have Judge Grauman, who believes that Ali is sincere. The two are not talking to each other. They don't know what each is saying, but Judge Grauman is going to provide his report to the Department of Justice. And he recommends approval of the status as conscientious objector. But this isn't a point of view that the Department of Justice really wanted to hear. They didn't agree with his assessment, and you'll see why shortly. But they set aside Judge Grauman's assessment, and it's like I say, it's not what they wanted to hear. And instead, they write a lengthy letter to the Louisville Selective Service Board. And they say, and quote, registrant's conscientious objector claim is not sustained. And we, Department of Justice, recommend to your board that he not so be classified. Selective Service Board knows that the DOJ had reached out to somebody, in this case, Judge Grauman, to have a formal assessment made. And so they're having the belief that those three assessments, after judgment, independent, that the three conditions have not been met. Department Justice says he doesn't meet any of the three tests. And the appeals board goes ahead and they go ahead and indicate he's been denied his request, and they don't state a reason. They simply say, request denied. And the Department of Justice never shares with the Selective Service Board anything that Judge Grauman had put together. So what about this letter? Department of Justice goes ahead and says, condition 1, opposition to all war. They believe that Clay, in this case, they constantly refer to him as Cassius Clay. You will find, if you go back into this and watch, you'll find that they refuse to call him Muhammad Ali. And they say Clay is simply opposed to serving in the United States military, that he's not opposed to all war. He just doesn't want to serve in the military. And under religious beliefs, they write that the Nation of Islam is opposed due to political and racial objections. So remember, here we are at the height now of the civil rights movement, and they're saying, no, this is all not about religion, but rather racial, political, that they do not agree that the observations of Muhammad Ali are truthful, but rather he is being influenced by Elijah Muhammad. And in terms of sincerity in their letter, they write, well, he has not consistently manifested his conscientious objector claim. By the way, they've never met him. They depended on the interviews of Judge Grauman. But these are the things they write as if they understand and know him. So in 1967, Ali moves to Houston. And it's there he's going to go ahead, since he's been denied by the Selective Service Board in Louisville. He files an appeal with the United States District Court there. And now he takes the position, I am a minister in the Nation of Islam. And in February of 1967, the U.S. District Court denies his appeal. And April 28th, that same year, he is now scheduled for induction. He's supposed to go in and be there. And the way this works is there's a line of people who have to be inducted, and they call out your name. And it's standing in line, you take a step forward, as if to say, I am joining my brethren. They call out his name. Cassius Clay, and he does not step forward. And they call out his name a second time. Cassius, they all know he's in the room. They call out his name a second time. He does not step forward. They call his name a third time, and he will not step forward. Well, he's in violation of the Selective Service Act. I will not step forward. And so in May, grand jury indicts him, and June, which is a rather fast turnaround time, he is found guilty by a jury of 6 white men and 6 white women of violation of the Selective Service Act. The failure to show up and step forward is a felony. And so the court issues its verdict. 5 years in prison, $10,000 fine. And I put up there the Houston Post. And so you see, by the way, again, you see they use Clay, not Muhammad Ali. He has 5 years, 10,000 fine. But more important, you see there right below it, fans write Cassius off. It matches up with this notion, the New York Times, Lipsyte, who writes for the New York Times that Clay is reprehensible and despicable and a taker, not a giver. And this is the sub-headline, is that, the fans are going to turn away from him. And you need to know, so at this moment in time, he is vilified all across America. And so what does he say? I'm expected to go overseas to help free people in South Vietnam, and at the same time, my people here are being brutalized. I would like to say to those who think I have lost so much, I have gained everything. I have peace of heart. I have a clear, free conscience. I am proud. I wake up happy. I go to bed happy. And if I go to jail, I'll go to jail happy. This is his statement of, I am a conscientious objector. I am opposed to war. I will not fight in your war. Well, back in New York State, the day of the announcement of the verdict, he's found guilty. His boxing license is suspended. And the World Boxing Association strips him of his title as heavyweight champion of the world. So not only have I lost in court, but my ability in the United States to earn a living has been taken away. My thing I hold dear, my heavyweight boxing championship, the belt, it's now not mine. It's been stripped away. I no longer hold the title. And they will go about the nation of finding a new heavyweight boxing champion. So he sees himself justice on trial. But he decides to appeal. And he's going to go to the Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and does so May 6th, 1968. And in fact, at that moment, U.S. Court of Appeals upholds his conviction of the 5 years and $10,000. And they find the role of an appeals committee is, has the judge in the U.S. District Court followed the law? Is the things that have been determined in terms of remedy been appropriate? And the U.S. Court of Appeals is saying, yes, all was fine with his conviction. Judge Ainsworth writes the majority opinion. It's a 3-judge panel. It's interesting that Muhammad Ali's attorneys requested that the case be heard en banc, which means the entire judges of the Fifth Circuit, and that was denied. The 3-judge panel, the majority opinion is being written up by Judge Ainsworth, and he, in looking for advice, which, the terminology is called stare decisis, we look to the past cases in order to determine how we will rule ourselves. And so he goes back to a World War I case in 1918 and reads from Chief Justice White, who said of a case similar, "It may not be doubted that the very conception of a just government and its duty to the citizen includes the reciprocal obligation of the citizen to render military service in case of need and the right to compel it." And so the Fifth Circuit agrees with the decision of the US District Court. Well, October of 1970, time has now passed by. There is anger in the United States over the Vietnam War. And the New York State Athletic Commission reinstates Ali's boxing license, which is terrific. He can now do things. But in March of 1971, he's going to fight Joe Frazier. So the former heavyweight champion of the world, never having lost, is now going to fight the current heavyweight champion of the world. And Ali suffers his first loss of his professional career. It's not a knockout, it's a 15-round decision. It's unanimous. But he's now back into the game of boxing. You know, people don't realize that, Ali took boxing not just into the United States. He took things around the world. You know, he went to Zaire later after this fight. And he's going to fight George Foreman in Zaire. And it's called The Rumble in the Jungle. And people don't realize the audience that day was 1 billion people worldwide. One of the reasons why I talk about Ali as a person of not of an American athlete, he is a worldwide figure, beloved. And everyone's watching the Rumble in the Jungle. And by the way, it was the Rumble in the Jungle that we are introduced to the rope-a-dope. And that's where he regains his title. But more important, we move forward. Ali is going to appeal to the Supreme Court, and they agree to hear the case. And oral arguments are going to be made in April. And this takes place, and the way it works is after the oral arguments are made, both sides, the justices go back into conference, and there'll be a straw vote looking at this. And then one of the individuals who is in the majority is going to be assigned by the Chief Justice to write the majority of opinion. Now, others may write, accompanying opinions to the majority, and those on the dissent can write opinions as well. This particular case is well documented in Bob Woodward's book, The Brethren. And in the conference, it's 5-3, finding Ali is guilty. It's 8 because Justice Thurgood Marshall decides to recuse himself, and that will come up later, and I'll share that with you. And it's Justice John Harlan who's selected to write the majority opinion. So enter the picture Thomas Krattenmaker, and he is so important to this case because he's the clerk to Justice John Harlan. And the interesting thing about clerks, they're going to go ahead and do all the research background. They're going to gather up all the materials. They're going to take all the materials from the U.S. District Court, from the Selective Service Board, from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, things that they might ask for of the Department of Justice. And Krattenmeyer is Harlan's clerk, and he's going to put all this together and then give information over to the Associate Justice. And Krattenmaker thinks the 5-3 decision against Ali is wrong. And he is never had said this, but he was opposed to the Vietnam War. So who is he? He got a bachelor's degree from Swarthmore. He got his Juris Doctorate, law degree from Columbia. But he was more than just, a clerk. He served in the Federal Communications Commission. He served with the Consumer Protection Agency. He was, you might call him a Washington insider. He is somebody who worked through agencies and was now also in the judiciary. And by the way, later in life, he becomes the dean and professor of the law school at the College of William and Mary. And so he is critical to this. Here you see on the right a photograph of him, as well as on the left, Justice Harlan. But it's Krautemacher that has issues with the Department of Justice. He sees that they did not share, the justice did not share Judge Grauman's opinion with the Selective Service Board back in Louisville. And that the DOJ keeps referring to, in that long letter, rule of law. And he's looking for rule of law and he can't find it. It doesn't exist. And he's looking at the materials from the Louisville Selective Service Board, and they never shared with Muhammad Ali a reason. Why is he being denied conscientious objector status? But then he finds out that the FBI and the Department of Justice have had wiretaps, illegal wiretaps on Muhammad Ali, and they have failed to disclose this to legal counsel, literally going back to the beginning. And it was their obligation. Meanwhile, John Harlan is reading. Supreme Court justices are well-learned people. And so if he's going to write about the Nation of Islam, he's going to read about it so that his majority of opinion rings true to the reader. Because people are going to literally soak in every word of a majority opinion. What is he saying? What is the nature of what he's saying? And he wants to learn about how the Nation of Islam views the nature of war and how that intersects with religion. And suddenly, he's reading various materials. He's talking to Krautemacher, and he's saying, I think they've misjudged Muhammad Ali's character and his stances. And then he finds out about the wiretaps, and now he's infuriated. And so he goes ahead and changes his vote. Now, instead of 5-3 against, it's 4-4. But the rules of procedure are a tie vote is not going to reverse the lower court's ruling. Somebody else has to change their vote. It's got to be 5-3. Enter Associate Justice Potter Stewart. He's the one that's going to break the tie. And he is equally disturbed in finding out that Judge Grauman's opinion had been withheld from the draft board. And he notes that even the DOJ are sitting there saying that the DOJ is not sincere in Ali's religious beliefs. And he's reading these materials where everyone is sitting there saying, yes, he is. And yet people in Washington are writing, no, he doesn't. And it's here that Stewart focuses on a technicality. And I know that people want things to be because it's the right thing to do, but sometimes courts deal with the technicality of failure. And because Ali was never told by the Louisville Selective Service Board why he was denied his status as a conscientious objector. This was a failure of administration. And so now Potter feels the entire case should be reversed. He becomes 5-3. Meanwhile, I mentioned the Solicitor General. Solicitor General represents the United States. And way back at the original US District Court case, he goes, we don't deny Ali's sincerity. And that becomes part of the record that the clerk in Harlan's office sees, as well as the other justices. And the opinion was not shared by the FBI nor the Justice Department with the defense. And the person who is the Solicitor General is none other than Thurgood Marshall. And this is the reason he recuses himself through the case. This is a picture of him as Solicitor General. So Harlan decides to couple this case with another one, Wells, because Muhammad Ali is not the only person who's seeking conscientious objection. And Harlan brings this case, Welsh versus the United States. And in it, now he's going to broaden what are the qualifications for conscientious objection. Because the question before the court in Welsh is, okay, it's not religious. There are individuals who believe there is a moral imperative to not supporting war, that there are ethical objections to supporting this war. And Harlan decides to bring this forward with Muhammad Ali's case. And he writes, and he says, you know, the boxer's beliefs are surely no less religiously based than those in the previous case. How he decides to couple these. Harlan, he is upset with the conduct of the Department of Justice and the FBI, and he says, we feel the error of law by the Department of Justice, to which the appeal board might naturally have looked for guidance on such questions, must vitiate the entire proceedings, at least where it is not clear that the board relied on some legitimate ground. Here, where it is impossible to determine on exactly which grounds the appeals board decided, the integrity of the selective service system demands, at the least, that the government not recommend illegal grounds. That long letter of rule of law that does not exist. Justice Stewart joins with Harlan. It's now 5-3 in favor. And the other three justices hearing in conference again to explain why these two have changed their vote. They are outraged and they decide to change their vote. And suddenly the case is Muhammad Ali 8, Justice Department 0. By the way, you know, there are some wonderful resources that you can go to. The Muhammad Ali's Greatest Fight details a great deal about this case. I think One Night in Miami, although it's more fiction than fact, is an important piece in understanding the civil rights movement. Woodward's book certainly gives an inside view of the Supreme Court. If you want to understand a little more about the history of conscientious objectors, I'd recommend Farron's book. And of course, I'm a huge fan of Ken Burns. I think he is the storyteller of our time. And his documentary on Ali is actually just an amazing piece of work. If you are more into the law, certainly the cases that I've shared with you today, Welch, Gillette, Seeger, Whitmer, Ciccarella, are all here. The wonderful thing about One Day University is this recording is going to go into the library. If you're interested in the two previous ones I did on the Rosenberg case and Brown versus Board, they're in the library. One Day University does a wonderful job of having these resources available to you if you're wanting to jot down the legal cases and go to them at a later date. Interesting piece. You know, remember that kid who is standing on the gold medal stand at the 1960 Olympics, coming back into Louisville and realizing his world in Louisville has not acknowledged his accomplishments, and he rises to embrace the civil rights movement. Ali says, man who views the world at 50 the same as he did at 20 has wasted 30 years of his life. Ali talks to us about growing and becoming the adults and citizens of the world that we should be. So allow me to say thank you for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure. And I thank One Day University for enabling me to do this and enjoying being with you. And let's now take some questions from the audience. There are some great questions in the chat line. So why don't we just get started? And first one being, one might say, every woman is a conscientious objector. Not one has a draft card ever. Care to comment? And of course, the answer is yes. Part of it is, I look at it as more of a paternalistic side to the military. Really, it's been only relatively recently that women have been admitted to the military academies. So I call it more paternalism and a good old boys club of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines before I would sit there and say that women were purposeful, conscientious objectors. Women have always been, by the way, opposed to war. In fact, someone said if we had women in charge, chances are we'd have less war. And there's a lot of truth to that. Individual asked the question, wasn't racism and religious prejudice part of the denial of his claim? Of course, the religious prejudice, came right out of the Justice Department in terms of the view of the Nation of Islam, not accepting it, viewing Elijah Muhammad as a political figure, a anti-American figure, a racist, a figure against white America. And so the reaction from the Department of Justice in issuing that lengthy letter in which, it was basically a lot of fabrication, it's one where you can't really look at that and avoid the fact of prejudice, deep prejudice, and denial of religious recognition throughout this. So absolutely. I have to chuckle because there's not a question but a comment. A woman said one of the audience nearly hit Muhammad Ali when he was in Miami. She nearly hit him with her car. I spent 6 years living in Louisville, and kept wanting to bump into him, and actually never actually bumped into him, even though I tried to traverse those spaces that he might be in, because I was always a huge, huge fan of his, and loved just watching him fight. Somebody asked a question I don't have the answer to, which is who bankrolled Ali's long journey through the justice system. Chances are he had amassed, prize fighters are very, very well paid, and he was the heavyweight champion of the world. I suspect that he would have had to have bankrolled a lot of this himself, as well as individual, either the American Civil Liberties Reunion or groups like that might have come. But I don't know for exactness, but I would say that's probably a lot of it he bankrolled himself. Someone says, I suspect J. Edgar Hoover was responsible for the illegal wiretapping and withholding evidence. Is that correct? And the answer to that is absolutely correct. Hoover, is the person who wanted to keep tabs on everyone he thought was subversive. And so it started with wiretaps of Elijah Muhammad and then went to Muhammad Ali. So yeah, no surprise there. How did Vietnam soldiers feel about the refusal to serve? Well, as I mentioned, every newspaper in America probably Stars and Stripes overseas at the time would have vilified him. It's really not till later that, it comes around and people see what's transpiring with the war, that the tone of America changes. And so initially, I would say, based on media, just judging media, he was absolutely vilified. And I expect that those who were in the service and had, volunteered or been called up would have viewed him that way initially. Years later, I'm friends with a group in morning. I'm telling them that I'm doing this talk. Folks who were Green Berets, people who served in Vietnam, and they loved Muhammad Ali. So there isn't this long-term nature that somehow what transpired back in the 60s makes sense to them today. An interesting question was, how fictional is really One Night in Miami? It's a really interesting thing because so much of it is built around truth, which is the fight did take place and the characters did get together. Just as an example, Sam Cooke wrote A Change Is Gonna Come. It comes out in an album, Ain't That Good News? And the album comes out in February of 1964. And the fight is February the 25th, 1964. The music, so in the movie, he's talking about, well, I'm working on this. I've found this, and it's kind of like this moment is going to change me. Well, in fact, for Sam Cooke, this had been building. And so he wrote that, according to the producers of the album, somewhere between February 1963 and December 1963. He wrote the song, and then it was part of that amalgam album. The interesting piece is Jim Brown. Jim Brown stopped playing football at the height of his career and saw the NFL as, the master, and that they owned him. Even though he was, the 1965, he was the MVP. They had won the national championship, the NFL championship. But he wanted to branch out and do other things, and things that would give him the freedom to express his anger, in his case, in terms of, the nature of racism in the United States, prejudice at the time, and the civil rights movement. The interesting thing is, going back to the first question about, isn't every woman a conscientious objector? The one person who's not in the story, who is at the heart of the civil rights movement, is interestingly, Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura. Each of these people, Brown and Muhammad Ali and Sam Cooke, are all affected by Martin Luther King Jr., as was she. She was going to quit Star Trek because she wanted to be more engaged in the civil rights program, the Dr. King. And Dr. King said, no, you provide a role model out there. And I think that's somehow the end of this story, this part of the story, is that each of these people, Jim Brown in football, and then going to the movies, a successful career in the movies. Muhammad Ali as an athlete, Sam Cooke as a musician, Malcolm X as a minister and religious leader. All of them are talking about wanting to raise up our view of the civil rights movement. Do you have any insights into his views on transgender athletics? I do not. I have no clue whatsoever. But I will say this, I'm looking as the time kind of slips away. Billy Crystal was his best friend, one of his best friends. In fact, it was Billy Crystal who gave the eulogy at Muhammad Ali's funeral. And I thought I'd read to you what Billy Crystal wrote. And it goes like this. He was a tremendous bolt of lightning, created by Mother Nature out of thin air, a fantastic combination of power and beauty. We've seen photographs of lightning bolts and the moment of impact, ferocious in its strength, magnificent in its elegance. And at the moment of impact, it lights up everything around it. So you can see everything clearly. Muhammad Ali struck us in the middle of America's darkest night, in the heart of its most threatening gathering storm. His power toppled the mightiest of foes, and his intense light shined on America. And we were able to see clearly injustice, inequality, poverty, pride, self-realization, courage, laughter, love, joy, and religious freedom for all. Ali forced us to take a look at ourselves. This brash young man who thrilled us, angered us, confused us, and challenged us, ultimately became a silent messenger of peace, who taught us that life is best when you build bridges between people and not walls. I want to thank all of you for joining me today and tuning in. Goodbye.